Thank you, Good. And I think my presentation follows quite well from what Good was saying, because whereas he was talking more about the sort of policy options and the policy responses, my interests lie very much in what communities faced with the dilemmas around sea level rise have actually kind of done for themselves, if you like. So that's the sort of the focus of my research at the moment, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm a social scientist, I'm a human geographer, so I'm more interested in, if you like, the kind of the software of community responses. So how do communities organize? How do they think, and how do they kind of grapple with these with this sort of sea level rise challenge that they're faced with? I just want to briefly say a bit about some of my past work, and what I'm trying to do is to bring some examples to you of what other communities have done when faced with sea level rise. So a lot of my research the past 7 or 8 years has been in the Maldives, and of course, as you'll know, I expect the Maldives is well known as a place that's threatened by sea level rise. Now, this is a fairly typical island, inhabited island in the Maldives. It's located in the Indian Ocean, and there's about 185 of these inhabited islands positioned there. And the challenge in the Maldives is that the coastline is always moving, it's always shifting, and everyone lives close to the coastline. So frequently, island populations are having to respond to erosion, having to respond to flooding, and sea level rise is adding to those already existing stresses. And they're having to organize and try to respond themselves in various ways, because of course government support isn't always there because resources are limited. Now, more recently, what I've done is I've started to look at similar issues in the UK context. So to give a few examples, in September 2021, I went to the community of Fairbourne in North Wales. And Fairbourne is facing a number of dilemmas. It's a very low-lying community, a coastal community, and it's facing a number of dilemmas around managed retreat and how to respond to this situation where essentially you've got all of the community that is at sea level and is only protected by this shingle bank and low sea wall. So they're currently trying to grapple with this problem. I've also spent time in Norfolk, and again, this is another area that's well known as a series of communities trying to respond to sea level rise. And the problem here, it's a bit different to Fairbourne. The problem here is you've got steep erodible cliffs that are being eroded and are retreating. And basically, as you can see in this picture, I mean, people's homes are literally dropping onto the beach and into the ocean. So again, the communities here are trying to respond to this problem. So in putting my presentation together, I asked myself sort of 3 questions. So based on these experiences, what have communities done to respond to sea levels? What have they done themselves? What's kind of worked and what's sort of gone well? What's been effective? And then what have been some of the main challenges that communities have faced as well? And in doing that, I've identified 3 main themes, and I'm going to talk about these themes and give some examples. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't about seawalls and policies. This is about how communities organize and how they think and how they kind of communicate as well to the wider world when faced with some of these challenges. Some of these things will be things that are already going on in Bude. Other things might be examples that we can think about and we can talk more about. So in general, what I've observed is the first thing that's gone on is that communities have built their own knowledge of how their coastline is working. And it was very interesting in Gerd's talk because he said, well, it's not just about the level of the sea, it's also about sediment and how sediment moves. And so communities, they've embarked on a process where they're building knowledge not just of sea level change, but actually knowledge about sediment, how that moves, knowledge about sea defenses, pros and cons, and knowledge about flooding risk. So the thing with knowledge is often it's divided up into what you might call scientific knowledge and what you might call local knowledge. So the scientific knowledge is the knowledge that's coming in from outside. It's what the kind of experts are bringing. The local knowledge, okay, is what people who are actually affected by sea level rise themselves know about their own environments, based on their kind of engagements with the natural world and with the coastline on a day-to-day basis, okay? So the things that people know, the things that people experience, the things that people observe. Now, one of the challenges in thinking about knowledge is that sometimes you get what's referred to as a hierarchy of knowledge, okay? And all that means is that different kinds of knowledges tend to get valued in different ways. So in general, scientific knowledge tends to get valued above local knowledge. Now that's fine, and of course scientific knowledge is really important. But actually what I've observed also is that local people or people experiencing or communities experiencing sea level rise also have knowledge about their environments. And that knowledge should also be, it can be overlooked and it can be discounted, but actually should be thought about and should be included. I've got a couple of quick illustrations of that. So this is a map of an island in the Maldives. This is actually the island that I showed you the picture of previously. And these are all the houses, and this is the coastline of the island. And all I've done here, this is something that I did, I went around with a couple of islanders, and we talked about how the coastline has changed and the history of how that coastline has changed. And we kind of annotated the map as we went. And the basic point here is there's actually tons and tons of information on this map. So people living in the Maldives on these islands, they know and they understand what's going on in their coastlines and how it's changing and the history of change. So there's a lot of information here that can be used, that can be utilized when we're thinking about community-led solutions to sea level rise. And actually what's also happened is that communities have gone further than this. So this is the community of Fairbourne in northwest Wales, and this is the sea, and this is the community here. And what Fairbourne community has done is that they have actually commissioned their own science. So they've done this independently of the local council because they themselves want to understand, well, actually, what is going on here? What are the viable options in terms of sea defenses, in terms of protection from flooding? So they have commissioned their own experts, okay, to actually develop their own particular flooding response or seawall construction response. And this is actually, this blue line here corresponds to embankments and seawalls. So in Fairbourne, they're actually doing their own science, if you like, as a way of trying to generate new options for the community. That's the first theme. The second theme is that whenever communities have been responding to sea level rise, they've been raising and trying to clarify, if you like, their position on issues around fairness and social justice. So, as I'm sure you'll be aware, one of the challenges with responding to sea level rise is that built-up places with large populations and lots of economic assets will normally be protected, because it works out in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. Now, smaller rural communities, like Fairbourne, for example, or some of the communities in Norfolk, or indeed in the Maldives, probably won't get that sort of protection because it doesn't work out in terms of the sort of the costs and the benefits of installing expensive sea defense works. So in these situations, what I've sort of seen is that it's been quite important for communities to kind of establish a position, if you like, on what they feel is fair and what isn't fair in terms of where resources are allocated and where attention is placed. And this links to something that was talked about, I think, on your last jury session with someone called Manda, I think it was. And she was talking about the importance of working together, the importance of solidarity. So having a position in the conversation about, well, actually, what is, in the bigger picture, what is fair and what is just in terms of how we are treated, if you like, in terms of sea defences, okay, and allocation of resources. That's really, solidarity and working together is really important in coming to that. Of course, a challenge related to that is that very often it's also important to understand, when we talk about fairness and social justice and solidarity, well, actually, how is the community, are there sort of divides in the community? What are the sort of key differences that exist? And how can we overcome some of those differences, which indeed is part of the sort of jury process that you're involved in today. So again, I want to give a couple of quick examples just to illustrate that. So this is in Norfolk. And as Good was saying, there's been extensive work in Norfolk to actually push the line out of the coast into the ocean. Now, one of the biggest high-profile projects in this region has been trying to push the coastline out in front of something called Bacton Gasworks, which is a large natural gas installation, okay, located along the Norfolk coast. So, because Bacton Gasworks is critical national infrastructure, a lot of resources are being put into protecting the gasworks. Now, of course, residents, okay, whose homes aren't protected have noticed this, okay? So they said, well, actually, what about us? Yeah. Now, of course, people in Norfolk realize that critical national infrastructure is always going to be protected, but they've looked along the coastline and said, well, actually, how are resources being allocated? What do we think is fair, and what do we think, how can we make our own voices heard? And they've been quite effective in terms of communicating. And finally, this is my last theme. Something I've observed is that when communities are responding to sea level rise, they've also been trying to build a story about change. So this is about the changes due to changes in the coast. How can these changes be explained? But also, what does it mean to the communities that are experiencing these changes? So again, this links to the importance of awareness raising, which I think you'll be talking about tomorrow on the jury. And actually, in terms of trying to secure external support, building that story and saying, well, not just what is happening, but what does it mean to us as a community? How can we explain this? How can we talk about this to people outside of Bude? And this is important also in terms of creating connections, not just with central authorities, but connections with other coastal communities that are facing similar dilemmas and thinking of ways of working together. So I just want to give a couple of quick examples before I wrap up of that. So this is an example from Norfolk. So you might have heard of the Haysborough footprints. Have you heard of the Haysborough footprints? Yeah. These are basically ancient footprints that were discovered, the fossilized footprints that were discovered in the beach as a result of accelerated beach erosion. And what the council has been trying to do is just, if you like, is to sort of give to try to put erosion in the county in a more positive light. Yeah, so it's been trying to say, okay, erosion can be a problem, but actually this is a feature. This is kind of who we are, and they've almost tried to turn erosion into a sort of almost like a tourist attraction in a way by talking about this is the fossil coast. This is, the deep history coast. So they've tried to put a positive message on some of the challenges. But at the same time, communities have also been doing similar things. So This is going back to Fairborn, that community in North Wales. Now, they've faced some challenges because of the way that the dilemmas faced by Fairborn community have been sensationalized in the media, and this is an example of that. So what they've tried to do is try to turn that narrative around and actually say, well, Fairborn isn't doomed. It's a community that is vibrant and has a future, and they've tried to sort of manage that narrative. So my time is up, so I'm just going to wrap up with a few key messages just to finish up. As I said, responding to sea level rise is as much about, I think, as about the software, how we think, how we behave, how we work together, as it is about the hardware of the materials and the finance. So as I've shown, I hope there's a lot that coastal communities can achieve by working together. I gave a few examples there. And building knowledge of the coastline and building awareness is important. But also I think as is, if you like, how is the community messaging, okay, to the wider world? How is it controlling that narrative? So what sort of stories of change do we want to tell, and how do you want to tell them? So thank you for listening.